In today's video, I'm going to show you how a 62-year-old couple with $1.6 million saved strategically timed their Social Security benefits. After years of helping people comfortably retire, I've learned that timing your Social Security benefits can be one of the most challenging parts of retirement planning. There are so many things to consider, and it's extremely easy to feel overwhelmed. So to clear up some of that uncertainty, I'm going to walk you through a real-life example of how I helped someone perfectly time their benefits. And by the end of this video, I hope that you'll have a clear understanding of the key factors to consider so that you can easily apply them to your own plan. Retirees all over the US struggle to find the confidence to pull the trigger and finally retire. And even when they are what I would consider overfunded, meaning they have more than enough money to appropriately stop work, as it turns out, the ridiculous complexity and the lack of transparency around Social Security decision-making is a huge bottleneck and a huge reason for the drought of confidence. Now, I recently worked with a 62 and 59-year-old couple who had $1.6 million saved and weren't sure when to claim Social Security. They told me that their lack of confidence and clarity around the Social Security claiming decisions was keeping them from retiring as soon as possible. The unfortunate reality is that if retirement decisions like Social Security can be made to seem complex, then therefore people work longer, spend less, and retire later. And the financial services industry has made a profession out of convincing retirees just like you that those things are to your advantage. Because at the end of the day, the financial services industry and the government both benefit when you delay retiring. The financial services industry specifically receives ever-growing fees based off of the money that you leave in their institutions. And the government receives more taxes and pays out Social Security later and benefits if you hop on Medicare later. Now, I was telling all of this to new clients of mine, John and Jane. John was fed up at work. A new manager had come in and the work environment had shifted in a direction that he was uncomfortable with. Jane, on the other hand, continued to enjoy her work, but was worried about John's health as a result of the stress of the new management relationship. Now, John was 62 and Jane was 59 when they came to speak to me about retiring. They had about $1,600,000 split. Roughly 70% of it was in pre-tax retirement accounts, with the remaining 30% in cash. At full retirement age, meaning age 67, John would receive $3,100 in Social Security benefits, and Jane would receive $2,500 in benefits. In addition, at age 62, John would have a small pension worth about $6,000 per year of income, and at Jane's 65, she would have pensions kicking off about $40,000 a year of income. They told me that they wanted a minimum of $11,000 per month after taxes for spending money, but even more importantly, they wanted to give annual gifts of $15,000 per year to their son. John wanted to retire as soon as possible, right? He had had some health issues and felt uncertain about how his body might hold up, especially with the changes to his work environment. Jane was happy working and wanted and planned to retire at age 64. But John and Jane both agreed that they wanted to know if she could retire today with John, because that meant that if anything changed with John's health, Jane would be able to confidently know she could stop working on a dime so that she could be home to be with John. Now, John and Jane both told me that they felt they had enough accumulated for at least John to stop working, but they just couldn't seem to get across that confidence threshold to actually have John retire. In particular, they told me they were hung up on understanding how Social Security claiming would influence whether John could retire or not. They said that they had used open Social Security, that they knew that the optimal financial route for the claiming decision, but even then it wasn't filling the confidence gap. They'd heard other information, things about the Trump administration advertising that they might make Social Security not taxable, and they were excited about that. But at the same time, the Biden administration had just signed a bill eliminating the windfall elimination provision, the WEP, and Jane was unsure if that would be to her benefit because she was a state employee. John and Jane were hearing all these details and reported to me that even though they knew most of that material would be good for them, it was just making their heads spin trying to find firm footing to project how their personal Social Security benefits might be impacted. Now, many of you watching this video are probably suffering from the same sensations of overwhelm, unsure how to truly evaluate retiring responsibly because of the whirlwind of details that you need to synthesize. You're imagining a world where making one small mistake might cause a catastrophic error and blow up the retirement that you've worked so hard for. Now, John and Jane were feeling this way, which is why they felt so overwhelmed trying to figure out a claiming strategy for their Social Security that fit into their plan. And I know that it can be tough to figure out what information to consider when planning. So to help you, viewers of this video, get started, I'm hosting a free class this week where I'll walk you through everything you need to know to time your benefits correctly and have your retirement timing down. So to sign up, just click the first link in the description below. Now, from everything I had learned about John and Jane, I knew that they were overfunded, meaning they had more than sufficient savings and income sources to allow for a comfortable retirement. But I understood the dilemma they were facing, the fear of getting something wrong, and I told John and Jane that we were going to go through a series of steps to help them clear the clutter and arrive at a position from which they could evaluate confidently their own retirement prospects, and therefore make a confident decision about Social Security claiming and ultimately pull the trigger on John's retirement. The first step of that process was going to be to test what I call the most aggressive retirement scenario for John and Jane, and then to work backwards from there. Now, the most aggressive scenario would be John and Jane both retiring tomorrow and claiming Social Security at age 70. This was the most aggressive scenario because it would require John and Jane to live the longest period of time, relying the most heavily on their retirement savings before adding in a new source of guaranteed income in the form of Social Security. So it would be a period of time with sustained high distribution rates. I explained to John and Jane that just because we were going to test the most aggressive scenario did not mean this was a recommendation or that it was the optimal scenario. It was just going to provide us a baseline against which to compare other scenarios, and also a framework that I could teach John and Jane so that they could make a Social Security but also a retirement timing decision based upon comprehension rather than guesswork. Now, the results of the first and most aggressive scenario are what you now see on your screen here. I explained that we were using a modern guardrails approach to tell us John and Jane's spending capacity. And this would tell us what the most they could spend each year would be based upon the data we input into the plan. Now, we toggled the modern guardrails to provide John and Jane a plan that would give them an 80% confidence they would underspend and a 20% likelihood they would overspend. Basically meaning they would have a 20% likelihood of having to make some spending adjustment at some point during retirement. In addition, we told the plan that John and Jane would prefer to make small but more frequent spending adjustments of 5% or less, rather than less frequent but larger and more difficult to absorb spending adjustments of, say, 10 or even 15%. Now, the results are what you can see on the screen here. Modern guardrails said that as long as John and Jane were comfortable with possible 5% downward spending adjustments, they could withdraw nearly $200,000 or 11% of their portfolio in year one, $162,000 or 10.33% of their portfolio in year two, and $156,000 or 10.46% of their portfolio in year three of retirement. Now, at the point at which both John and Jane would claim Social Security, so in 2037, which is the last row on here, so I've taken a 10-year hop forward, at their ages 74 and 70 respectively, when they would both be claiming Social Security and have their full Social Security benefits, were they to claim at 70, John and Jane would only be withdrawing $19,700 of their portfolio, or 1.6%. And so what's happening here is that they'd be withdrawing a lot more earlier in retirement with the anticipation that they would be have much smaller or lower withdrawal rates later in retirement as a product of the larger deferred Social Security benefit. Now, in addition to all of this, they would have a lower guardrail of 20%, meaning they would not have to make a spending reduction unless their portfolio were to go down by 20% in value. Now, we further tested the plan by using historical Monte Carlo data, and the results came back showing that even in this most aggressive scenario, where both John and Jane were to retire as soon as possible and delay Social Security as long as possible, 88% of the tested scenarios would allow for even more spending than shown on this chart here. Now, after showing this to John and Jane, I explained that this was just one data point and that we were going to proceed with 2 additional tests. The best way to think of these 3 test scenarios is a version of guardrails themselves, kind of like bumper lanes in a bowling alley. We were going to test a most aggressive scenario that would be at the upper end of the range of tolerance, and then we're going to test a least aggressive scenario that would provide the floor of that range of tolerance, and then we're going to test a moderate scenario that was somewhere in between. Now on the screen here now is John and Jane's moderate scenario. You can see here the chart is formatted exactly the same, but in this scenario, John would retire as soon as possible, Jane would retire as soon as possible, but John would claim Social Security at 70 while Jane would claim early at 62. Now, as long as John and Jane were comfortable with the same possible 5% spending adjustment requirements, then in this scenario, they could withdraw nearly $201,000 or 11%, almost 12% of their portfolio in the first year of retirement. And then it would go down to $165,000 or 10% roughly in year 2, and then $160,000 or 10.5% in year 3. And then at the point at which both John and Jane would have Social Security with their full benefits, they would end up withdrawing $39,600 or 2.86% of the portfolio. And again, this functions very similarly to the most aggressive scenario, which is future low distribution rates would be subsidizing earlier higher distribution rates were they to both retire earlier. Again, we tested their Monte Carlo historical data, and we found that in this scenario, they got a modest increase in probability of success to 89% of scenarios, which would allow for more spending than shown here. This moderate scenario actually looks like a slight improvement from a Social Security claiming perspective because it allows more spending in early retirement, but it also increases their Monte Carlo performance. And this should make sense because it is actually a less aggressive scenario than both of them delaying Social Security till 70, and their portfolio withdrawal rates would actually go down in some of the years between 27 and 2037, which you just don't see on the chart here. Now let's toggle down to our third and final scenario here. And this is a scenario where John retires as soon as possible and Jane would work until age 62, so 3 more years, at which point she would claim Social Security at 62, while John would continue to defer until age 70. Now here you can see that as long as John and Jane were again comfortable with that same 5% spending adjustment, they could withdraw nearly $136,000 in the first year of retirement, which would be 8.1%. It would pop up to $164,000 in year 2, or roughly 10.68%, drop back down to 8.5% in year 3 at roughly $127,000 a year. And then again in 2037, at which point both of them would have their full Social Security benefits. They would have withdrawal rates of roughly 3.15% at a dollar amount of roughly $51,700. Now, one thing I didn't mention, and I should mention here, is that in all 3 of these tested scenarios, they would be having the same amount of spending money each year. The change would just be how much would be coming from income sources like work or Social Security versus how much would be coming from portfolio withdrawals. Now, after testing this third and final scenario using, again, historic Monte Carlo data, we can see that 94% of tested scenarios in this third scenario would allow for more spending than what's shown here on the chart. Now, needless to say, this least aggressive scenario here actually comes out the most favorable. And again, this makes sense because it's the least aggressive scenario. I explained to John and Jane that the key idea here is that by testing and framing in this manner, John and Jane can have a range of scenarios that they can work towards and know that they can make adjustments along the way if things don't go to plan. So they could claim Social Security at both of their ages 70, and it would provide them with the highest base of guaranteed income. But then John and Jane would need to rely on their portfolios for an extended period of time with high distribution rates. Not only that, but John's longevity concerns come into play here, and it's really a gamble whether he would actually receive significant financial benefit as a result of delaying Social Security till age 70. However, if they could delay that long, John and Jane's portfolio would have extremely low distribution rates from 2037 onward, and the portfolio would start to grow again, resulting in a potentially larger legacy at the end of the second spouse's, in this case Jane, her life, because they would have very, very modest small withdrawals from the portfolio from her age 70 till her end of life. Now, I explained to John and Jane that for people in their position, I like to think of Social Security as a triaging mechanism for when plans go wrong, either due to poor market performance or due to sudden sustained increases in cost of living. John and Jane understood all this, and they said to me that the issue they took with the most aggressive scenario is that because of the many years of high distribution rates before Social Security, if they were to wait till 70, they might not end up being comfortable with annual gifts to their son, which was really a pivotal point of their financial plan. And they said that either the moderate or least aggressive scenario seemed more to their liking. Even though they could see now that they actually had more than enough money and both John and Jane could retire today if they wanted to, Jane was more than happy to work a few more years and take things year by year. And John and Jane were also comfortable delaying John's Social Security, knowing that they had 2 rounds of ammunition in the chamber. The first round being to claim Jane's Social Security at 62 if they felt they needed an extra source of income while they continued to delay John's Social Security. And the second round of ammunition would be claiming John's Social Security at any point in between Jane's age 62 and John's age 70, because if they had a scenario in which they could support waiting to claim until both partners were age 70, meaning deferring as long as possible, it was the case that claiming any earlier would actually only improve their odds of financial success. And they explained to me that seeing things in this manner, having multiple scenarios that in and of themselves could act as plan guardrails, was extremely helpful. They realized that they did not actually need to commit to a specific Social Security claiming strategy today in order to retire. What they needed was simply a framework with which to evaluate Social Security's possible impact on their retirement timing so that they could first get John across the retirement threshold and then slowly but surely work Jane's way there. John and Jane said that after seeing the different scenarios, they realized that they had far more options than they originally thought. They no longer felt stuck. Now they had a clear plan and the confidence for John to retire without regret. Being able to untie the knots about the Social Security decision such that they could confidently save John's healthy lifespan rather than letting it slip away was a huge benefit for them. They now knew that they could retire and had many good claiming options ahead of them that would each serve a unique purpose in keeping their financial plans healthy and sound. So I hope that the exercise and the story I just shared with you about John and Jane helped you see all the crucial factors that influence your Social Security, but also your retirement timing decisions. And the most important thing I hope you can take away from this video is that timing your benefit is actually highly personal. I'm sure you noticed that John and Jane's situation was probably different in many ways than yours. So if you start making decisions without understanding your situation, you could actually be doing more harm than good. And so to help you properly time your benefits, but also your retirement timing decisions, I'm hosting a free class this week. I'm going to show what factors to consider and all the nuances and rules around Social Security, as well as how to make an informed decision when claiming your benefits and timing your retirement. So to sign up for that class, just click the first link in the description below this video. Thank you as always for your time and attention. See you in the next video.